Life is a journey, best shared with epic people. We're sharing stories of great adventure, whether it's the physical odyssey of climbing Mount Everest, scaling a business, overcoming personal adversity, or designing your dream life. Hop on board as we strive to better ourselves, each other, and our communities. I'm your host, Ryan Munsey, and this is the Better Human Project.
That's machine-to-machine communication. And we're doing this. I don't know why, except to make more money and get people to buy more things. In 2013, manufacturers were making more transistors than farmers were growing grains of wheat or rice. Manufacturers are now making 1,000 times more transistors than farmers are growing grains of wheat and rice combined.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Better Human Project. This week we are talking to my go-to source for all things technology and health related. And you're going to meet an amazing person today, Katie Singer. And just a brief bio on Katie. She's the author of the book An Electronic Silent Spring. That's her most recent book, and it reports on the health and environmental impacts of exposure to electromagnetic radiation emitted by electronic devices and infrastructure. She's currently finishing a book about the internet's energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, toxic waste, worker hazards, and climate impacts. Katie is not just somebody who knows about this stuff and is trying to get her message out. She actually spoke about this stuff at the UN in 2018 during their Forum on Science, Technology, and Innovation. She is literally at the pinnacle of the world's conversation around these topics. We are really fortunate to have a resource like Katie to share this information with us. In 2019, she was on a panel at Real Truth Talks with the climatologist Dr. James Henson. Her websites, ourweb.tech and electronicsilentspring.com are going to be linked for you guys in the show notes. There are some incredible resources that Katie is going to mention in our conversation today. And like I said, you'll be able to go straight down to the show notes, scroll down there, click on those links, and you can check those out. I definitely recommend checking out the resource that we talk about, where she talks about her campaign. It's actually going to be one of the first ones linked in the show notes. It says start here. Really, really valuable information in there. So one other quick note that I just want to throw out there as we dive into this conversation. Katie and I have recently been reconnected. I met her several years ago and did an amazing, insightful, to me, it was a life-changing podcast. She really shed a lot of light for me on how our devices are impacting our health. At the time, I wore a Fitbit, and I remember taking it off during the interview and never put one back on. So life-changing is literally like she changed my habits with technology. And I think if you're open to these conversations, that it will do the same for you. And the point here that I want to make, and the point with these conversations, is not about reverting back to the Stone Age. It's not about regression. But the question is, how do we advance? How do we move forward in a way that doesn't negatively impact our health, doesn't negatively impact our the ecosystem and the environment and the world, and also there's going to be a financial and economic repercussion to a lot of these things as well. And so we're going to talk about a few things that are in the new documentary, The Planet of the Humans. And if you've seen that, or if you do watch that, you'll quickly see that follow the money, and you'll understand why people are doing what they're doing. So it's not as easy a conversation as it's not black and white, it's not binary. There are tons of shades of gray in this conversation. And the thing that I want to to do for myself, and the things that I want to be able to share with you as the concerned listener and person who examines their life, is to provide, the information so that you can, make your own informed choices. And if you are interested in reducing exposure, reducing consumption, as I am, then I think there will be plenty of action items and kind of first steps for you in these conversations. And so, like I said, we're going to have Katie back on. In this episode, we talk about the internet's footprint and its usage, how much information, or I'm sorry, how much material and energy it consumes, things that we just are completely unaware of. We're going to have Katie back on to talk about electric cars. She's got a paper that's going to be published in the coming weeks on, we really need to do our due diligence there. We'll talk about solar. We'll talk about a lot of different things. So as you listen to this, if you have questions, send them in. I would really love to, incorporate your questions into these conversations as much as we can. This is, not just my platform to interview people. This is our platform to have conversations. And the more you guys can send in those questions, the more we can incorporate your thoughts and concerns into, these conversations as we bring Katie back and try to continue this conversation. So I'm going to shut up. Here's Katie. Hope you enjoy this one. And like I said, look forward to hearing your feedback. Katie Singer, welcome to your first Better Human project, but our second conversation. As I said in the intro, this is going to be the first of several. We've arranged for you to be a repeat guest as we look a little bit deeper into some of these important issues that impact our health and our future. You and I had an incredible conversation several years ago on my old podcast, the Optimal Performance Podcast. And if I can find that link, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But anyway, without further ado, welcome back. And I'm really excited to continue our conversation.
I am so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Are you ready to jump in?
I'm ready.
Okay. So we have today is we've decided that we're going to start with the internet's footprint, and that's going to entail energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, toxic waste, worker hazards. There's a lot of collateral, I don't know if damage is the right word, that comes with our increased use of the internet. I guess the best place to start maybe would be to have you lay out for us the internet's usage and the footprints. Like what about it creates this drain?
Okay, so I often start by saying that the internet is the largest thing that humanity has built. And its electricity use, greenhouse gas emissions, toxic waste, worker hazards, those things are in proportion to it being the largest thing that we've built. And yet all of those things are invisible to us. We're working right now, we're recording this podcast using lots of equipment, and even though there are microphones and screens and keyboards and all that involved, the basic infrastructure required to make this podcast happen is still invisible, certainly to me and to people listening. I'd like to spell out some of that infrastructure and make the true costs more visible to us. And once we get to that place of seeing what it really takes to do a podcast, to stream a video, all those kinds of things, once more people know that, then we can start working collectively to reduce the footprints. So, shall I?
All right,
you want me to jump in?
Yep, you've got my wheels are spinning. I want to know what is the true cost of me streaming a 20-minute video on YouTube.
Okay. Let me name 3 main energy guzzlers. The first I'm going to go back to a bunch of times. It's embodied energy. That's the energy used to manufacture the device on your desk or in your hands. And I'm going to talk more about embodied energy. But every single device holds energy, embodied energy, in its design. That takes an incredible amount of energy. There are robotics involved, 3D printers. Those are really energy intensive machines. And they also hold embodied energy. So there's the design of the device, then there's mining for the raw materials. We can call that extraction. Then there's water for washing the ores and smelting and refining them and transporting them to their next station. Then they get to assembly plants that have solvents for cleaning the circuit boards, for example, and everything is getting transported to different stations and to the final assembly plant. And then the thing gets boxed and shipped to you, the end user. Okay, that's embodied energy. And so that's one major energy guzzler involved in streaming your video.
And just ask you a question there. So one of the things the last thing you mentioned is, the thing gets boxed and shipped. And I think one of the things that, we sometimes look at is packaging, and we may say, oh, this has, eco-friendly packaging or, things like that. So with everything you just mentioned, I guess I realize that a big theme of our whole conversation is reducing consumption when we can and how we can. So I feel like the answer is probably some is better than nothing. But when we look at something that has great embodied energy, but might come in an eco-friendly or post-consumer packaging, like is it really doing what we think it's doing?
That you've just asked a really big question, and I want to go back to it,
okay.
But I want to talk about the other guzzlers first.
Okay.
But I really want you to ask that question again because I'll
make a note. We'll come back to it.
We'll come back to it. Okay, great. And I love it that you're sitting there with tons of questions. And I hope that everyone listening is doing exactly the same thing because we need those questions. Every time I talk with someone about this stuff, they come up with questions that I do not know the answer to. But my response just that you've asked it gets those wheels churning. And that's how we can get to what I think you're pointing us to, which is, all right, how do we really reduce what we're doing? How do we reduce the impact of what we're doing? Now, so embodied energy is one of the main guzzlers. Mm-hmm. Then in order for this thing to happen right now, we need access networks. So we're both connected to the internet right now. And that means there are satellites involved, there are fiber optic cables, probably some copper wiring. You might have a router at your station. I'm connected to my phone line and to internet access through my phone line. Then there are antennas. We could go on and on and on. There are lots of parts to the infrastructure that allows us to be talking right now. Access networks are major consumers of energy on this planet. number 3 is data storage centers. So we're going to store this recording in a data storage center. Like it'll go on your website and then to a data storage center. Data storage centers are everywhere. They're on university campuses, they're in hospitals, in businesses. Some of them are just plain warehouses that are so large you can see them from outer space. Inside, they're covered from floor to ceiling with servers, with computers that, of course, all have embodied energy and that are being replaced pretty frequently so that they're faster and more able to handle more data. Data storage centers also need cooling systems. We're talking swamp coolers and air conditioning units, which of course also take water. If data storage centers were a country, they would rank 5th in use of energy on planet Earth. They take an enormous amount of electricity. Now, so those are 3 things. There are other guzzlers to the internet, but if we go back to your question, where I went with it, and you might ask it again, but I can tell you another piece that I want understood when we're talking about all this is something called the Jevons paradox. This is talking about energy efficiency. So if we have devices that are really efficient, it actually increases energy consumption and consumption of other natural resources. Because when you lower the cost of something and it's really efficient, and so you make 1 billion iPhones or screens or whatever, in order to make 1 billion of anything, you're going to use a lot more energy and you're going to extract a lot more resources to do it. So energy efficiency, any kind of efficiency, is actually the cause of increased energy consumption and increased consumption of natural resources.
Yeah, I can see why they called that a paradox.
William Jevons came up with this in 1865. He wrote a book called The Coal Question, and he realized that, oh, wow, lives were much more efficient because of coal and engines, trains that were distributing goods like denim jeans and cast iron pots all around Europe. How cool is that? But it was more efficient for people who didn't have to make their own shirts anymore or their own jeans, but it increased energy demand because the prices were lower and more people were buying.
So the 2020 version of that would be Amazon Prime.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, where do you go with that? That's good. Yeah.
Okay, so we have the 3 main energy guzzlers.
Yes.
So that's internet usage. I guess maybe the next question would be, if we think about the tools we use to connect to the internet, we have computers, we have cell phones.
Yeah.
I guess maybe we look at cell phones because go ahead.
Yeah, let me give 2 figures, one about laptops and one about smartphones. So I'm going to be going back to embodied energy. So an electronic device has a lifespan from its cradle to its grave. So the cradle phase is where it's designed, and then there's extraction of its raw materials and refining of its raw materials, transporting them to the next station, going on to the assembly plant, all those things that I talked about a few minutes ago. Then it gets to the end, it's shipped to the end user, and you turn it on for the first time. Then the device has its usable life. And then you might have to recharge it. You plug it into an electric outlet, whatever. It's got a usable life, and then it's discarded. Parts might be recycled, but then it's got to get shipped to a recycling station, and that actually also takes energy, or it might go just straight to garbage. Okay, from the cradle to the time that you turn the device on for the first time, that consumes 81% of the energy that the laptop will use in its whole lifespan.
That's crazy.
81% of the laptop's energy is consumed before you turn the device on. And I can give you this figure from IEEE, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, from Spectrum, which is their journal. I assume that for most computers, it's about the same figure. And most devices now include computers. Certainly cars all have lots of computers inside of them, and even refrigerators now will have computers inside. I mean, everything now is digitalized. So they're all going to have a similar amount of energy embodied in those devices and appliances.
Right. So it won't necessarily be 81%, but it will be something higher than what most people would expect.
It'll be around 80%. I have read figures that are even higher.
So that's crazy. I mean, so like, I'm glad you brought up refrigerators. I mean, I hadn't even thought about that, but I've seen, like, not to name brands, but like I think of Samsung, and I guess the same thing with like an electric car. Like, we think we're using less, but is it really more, or is that going to be a comparable number to a gasoline car that also has a computer in it now?
Right. So that's a really good question. And I'm thinking that I'm finishing a paper right now about electric vehicles, and we should dedicate a whole conversation to that, to that subject. But that's a really good question. Is it really true that you're reducing your ecological footprint when you buy an electric vehicle? If we go back to the refrigerator issue, what's happening with the Internet of Things, and the Internet of Things is where all things will have a chip in them and they'll connect. So, for example, with a refrigerator, it can have sensors, and then you go to the grocery store and buy orange juice, and it'll have a chip, and the refrigerator can pick up that you're running out of orange juice and you need to buy more. And so it will send a message to your smartphone that you need more orange juice. That's machine-to-machine communication. And we're doing this. I don't know why, except to make more money and get people to buy more things. But the refrigerator is, the idea before COVID-19 was that the refrigerator would be a central hub in your house, and it would be able to send messages to your smartphone so that you would know what to buy when you're at the grocery store, for example. Other examples of Internet of Things communications would include diapers. You already can buy diapers that have a chip in them that will send a message to your smartphone that your baby's diaper needs changing.
All right, I got to jump in on that one. So, one of the
All
questions
right.
that I asked a few of our listeners to submit some questions, and some of their questions were specific to 5G, and we'll get to that. I'll bring this question back up when we get into that part of this conversation. But one of the major concerns is the impact on young people and developing people. So, with this chip being in a diaper, very close proximity to maybe even making contact with, a newborn baby, a developing human. What is the risk? What's the exposure risk to cellular damage, DNA damage, neurological things?
Right. That's a really good question. We don't have studies. That does not mean that it is safe. That means that we're marketing stuff with no studies. I can tell you, this is an aside, but years ago I wrote books about natural birth control, natural family planning, and I learned that when baby boys have plastic covered diapers, which is pretty common, that traps heat around their reproductive organs. And during the first 6 months of a baby boy's life, he will have testosterone levels as high as an adult male. He's doing an incredible amount of development during that time. If the temperature is hot, which plastic will do, it'll intensify the heat,
Right.
then that will impact his development in a harmful way. So I think it increases his risk of testicular cancer, for example.
Wow.
So if you combine a plastic coated diaper with a chip, there's a question. We don't have studies. Now, in response to 5G, let me explain that 5G, which stands for fifth generation of wireless infrastructure, it's designed to support the Internet of Things. So as we increase the data, the digital traffic that we are running all the time with all these increased devices, we need more infrastructure, or so the industry says. There are other people who say that 4G, fourth generation of wireless infrastructure, can handle the increased data. The industry says, no, we need 5G. With 5G, the way it'll be laid out, and it is being deployed in some places already, there will be cell sites, they're called small cells, every 3 to 10 houses. So that's a lot of infrastructure. Right now, we have cell towers that will, if you're making a mobile call, you'll link to the nearest cell tower.
Right.
Here, you'll link to a small cell site, and the speed will be supposedly much, much faster. You'll be able to stream videos much faster and more frequently. And that will put cellular antennas every 3 to 10 houses. So again, there are no studies really looking at 24/7 exposure of those frequencies or in combination with 4G and 3G, which are already operating in combination with smart meters, which is another kind of electromagnetic radiation that's ubiquitous in our environment now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder that, I think a lot of us are guilty of assuming that if 5G comes, or becomes the thing that it would replace. And maybe it's replacing in terms of what we use, but it's not like 3G and 4G are going to disappear. Those waves are still out there. So
It's not going to be replacing anything. It's just going to be in addition.
okay. So, I mean, I know in our previous conversation, we talked about some of the ways that cell phones and that electromagnetic radiation can negatively impact DNA and, cellular integrity. What does that look like with 5G? Because it's a much different wavelength, and that's the reason that these cell sites would have to be so close together, right? I mean, it travels a significantly shorter distance.
That's true. It doesn't travel far. And the frequencies that 5G is using or will use, those are those are not really clear. So in some cases, they are in the gigahertz range, which is more, those are billions of vibrations per second. And in some cases, they're, I think, at about 600 megahertz, which would be much less. Because they don't penetrate far, they need to be ubiquitously deployed. But these frequencies can carry much more data, and that's what we're going for. That's the engineering goal.
Right.
How will these impact biological creatures? Well, again, we don't really have studies. There are very minimal studies. But when the frequencies are teeny tiny, which they will be, then scientists are thinking that insects especially will be impacted, and our skin and eyes will especially be impacted. But again, we don't have studies. That does not mean it's safe.
Right.
That means we don't know.
I guess.
Can I go back to, I just want to, let me go back a little to embodied energy.
Sure.
And talk about smartphones. One smartphone holds more than 1,000 different substances. So, what makes it do all those magical things? I can lay out some of what goes into a smartphone, and that would explain more of the energy embodied and the worker hazards and toxic waste emitted in the process of manufacturing one smartphone. We can talk about transistors, for example, which are the basic building blocks of every computer. How do you get transistors? Well, and I'll give you a mind-blowing statistic. In 2013, manufacturers were making more transistors than farmers were growing grains of wheat or rice.
You mean singular grains?
Right. Now, 7 years later, manufacturers are now making 1,000 times more transistors than farmers are growing grains of wheat and rice combined.
There can't be that many cell phones. What else are these transistors being used for?
Well, computers are in everything, but also transistors now are teeny tiny. They're smaller than grains of wheat and rice. One smartphone can have 1 billion transistors in it. One iWatch. So but we don't know how. Let me tell you how transistors are manufactured. And I'll just tell you my kindergarten level of it. Mm-hmm. And I can give you a link so people can learn more if they want to dive more deeply. you start with mining pure quartz gravel. Then you need a hard, dense, moist wood. This can come from the Amazon rainforest. Then you need a pure carbon. That can be petroleum coke, which is a byproduct of oil drilling from places like the tar sands. So you take those three ingredients, the quartz, the carbon, and the wood, and you ship them internationally to a smelter that's kept at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, typically for 6 or 7 years at a time. And you put those three things into the smelter, and out comes metallurgical grade silicon. That's 98% pure. Not nearly pure enough for electronic grade silicon. You can only have 1 impurity part per billion for electronic grade silicon. And so then the metallurgical grade silicon is transported to another kind of furnace for what's called a vapor deposition process. The metallurgical grade silicon is melted and it turns into a liquid and then to a vapor, and all the impurities come out of it. So, but we're only at step 2, but now you've got polysilicon. And I should clarify, this is the same process used for manufacturing silicon wafers that you see under the glass in solar panels, and also for making fiber optics. The fiber optics cables, the threads that pulses of light run on, are also made from very pure silicon.
So when you like when let's like in I guess like one of the things in the news right now is the documentary Planet of the Humans, and so when somebody watches that, or when folks read your paper that's going to be published soon, and you're talking about the true cost of electric cars or solar, like that's part of that embodied energy that goes into these things.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. And in Planet of the Humans, there's a segment with a lot of pictures of smelters, and and it's all about silicon. In solar panels, you can have 1 impurity part per million. In electronics, we can only tolerate 1 impurity part per billion.
Okay. Right.
Okay, so
that was step 2. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was step 2, and I'll send you a link so people can read about the other steps involved. But you get the picture. It's really energy intensive. I can actually let me tell you something here. What happens at a silicon plant is it's really they have a lot of toxic emissions. And hold on, I'm looking. Here we go. Okay, so this is there's a metallurgical manufacturing plant in upstate New York, Globe Metallurgical, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation issued Globe Metallurgical a permit that names the allowable hazardous air emissions per year. This was in April of 2016, so 4 years ago. So Globe Metallurgical can emit the following toxins per year: carbon monoxide, up to 250 tons per year; formaldehyde, 10 tons per year; hydrogen chloride, up to 10 tons per year; lead, up to 10 tons per year; oxides of nitrogen, 250 tons per year; particulates, up to 250 tons per year; polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, up to 10 tons per year, sulfur dioxide, 40 tons per year, and sulfuric acid mist, 7 tons per year. Now, most silicon is manufactured in China, and they don't have regulations like we've got in New York State. We, of course, have other smelters all over the U.S. and other countries, but just to give you an idea, that's from one smelter.
That's crazy.
So there, it's a pretty, and that's just, we're just talking about the transistors. There's so much else that goes into
Right.
just one smartphone.
That's one component of a phone that has 100 different, let's call them ingredients.
1,000.
1,000 different
Yeah.
ingredients. Right.
Yeah. And I can say here, I have posted at ourweb.tech/campaign. I've posted about 100 of the substances that go into a smartphone. And I've got questions like how much is a worker paid for a daily wage, and what are the impacts to waterways around the mining and the smelting. And I've got questions like that. And my idea is if each person could research one substance on that list and share it with classmates and coworkers and family members, then we would all start learning what's really going on here. I think it would be fabulous.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you brought that up, because you shared that link with me before we recorded, and I've checked that out, and I told you, I mean, that's an impressive tool that you have to show people the extent of, I don't want to say the problem, but like the thing that we really need to have an open dialogue about, an open and honest dialogue about this, because everything you just said in this interview was about transistors and one component and 3 ingredients, and there are over 1,000. And in this, when you get, we'll have the link to this in the show notes, and if you guys listening go click on this link, you're going to see about 100 things that Katie has listed, and you're not going to know what half of those things are, and they all have a similar story to what Katie just laid out. And I mean, I like my technology as much as anybody, but like I had no idea that all of that went into this, and I think that's the important thing that, you know, Katie is doing with her work, and things like Planet of the Humans are forcing us to reconcile. I mean, we can't ignore this anymore, and that's really why I'm excited to have Katie, have you on, and have these conversations, because, you know, we do believe in, you know, leading an examined life, and this is part of that. I know we're kind of bouncing around a little bit from the outline that we talked about. So have we covered everything that you wanted to hit with embodied energy? And you know, we got into, okay, so we talked about cell phone, like smartphone ingredients, but we didn't even talk about conflict minerals yet. That's one of the ingredients.
Yeah. Yes. So conflict minerals are minerals extracted, mined under abusive conditions.
I think most people would be familiar with like conflict diamonds in Africa. Right.
And coltan, we can talk about coltan, which is used in pretty much every mobile device. So if you have an electric shaver without a cord, it's going to have coltan. If you have any kind of mobile phone, it'll have coltan, COLTAN. That's short for columbite tantalite, and it's mined primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And more people have been murdered over coltan than any other single event since World War II. We're talking millions of people. The 2018 Nobel Peace Prize went to Denis Mukwege. He's an MD, And he was given the award because he dedicated so much of his life to repairing the vaginas of women who've been brutally raped over coltan. It's an incredibly complicated system. There's an excellent film that I list in the campaign to reduce our internet footprint where I name 100 of the substances in a smartphone. The film is called Congo My Precious. I've got a link to it at our web.tech/campaign. And you can begin to get introduced to the problem with coltan. We also have, there are so many other things that go into batteries and smartphones, like lithium. Everyone hears about lithium ion batteries. Lithium, I think of it being similar to a salt. It's a metal, and I think the word is harvested, but I'm not sure. It's taken from what are kind of like salt flats often in South America. And it's a very simple process. You just take it out and then you keep applying more water, which evaporates until you get a kind of lithium that is usable for phones. The issue is that to manufacture 1 ton of lithium, you need 500,000 gallons of water. And that will be taken from farmers and farming communities for their cooking and bathing so that we can have mobile devices.
Because I'm sure you can't use like seawater. You'd probably have to use fresh water that doesn't have salt.
Probably so. I don't know the answer there, but I'm going to guess so. Yeah. So lithium, there's another substance, and it's not considered a conflict mineral, but
it has a high cost as part of that embodied energy component.
Right. Copper, is there. There's a lot of copper, obviously, on the circuit board, and that there's so much waste involved in mining copper, in mining any metal. So we could go on, but you'll see the list at our web.tech/campaign. And yes, conflict minerals are also a big part of the picture.
Okay. So, yeah, we've mentioned it. We'll have links to those in the show notes. But I want to spend some time talking about the part of your work that you focus on, and I think the part of this conversation that is really going to be where our listeners can apply their efforts and put action into this, and that is, how do we move towards reduced consumption, reduced emissions? What, like, when we hear these things, I mean, some of these things are just really difficult to wrap your head around, and then others are almost deflating because at least for me, I hear some of this and I'm like, well, I mean, what do we do? How could we possibly, reverse any of this or change any of this? So on an individual basis, I know the number that you've talked about is, 3%. If we can reduce our consumption as an individual by 3%, obviously it needs to be higher than that, but 3 is a good start. Like, what does that look like?
Well, when I thought of that, I was thinking, I gave myself the assignment to reduce my consumption by 3% per month.
Okay.
So it's an
like compounding
thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Where I would continue reducing by 3% per month. I mean, right now, I don't know what has, because of the virus and everybody not being able to shop and not having income, obviously consumption is changing drastically, but maybe not drastically enough if we're really looking at continuing to decrease our ecological impact here. So I can say that seemed like a doable thing for me to try for.
Right.
3% per month. Now, what are some of the things you can do? One, I'll say wireless telecommunications. Wireless communications use at least 10 times as much energy as wired. So as much as you can get a wired phone and wired internet access, that is better. Now, it's not simple because it means you're probably going to be buying new equipment, and that will all have embodied energy to it. Mm-hmm. And the providers are going to be deploying wireless infrastructure whether we use it or not. But if more of us go to wired, that would be great. Anyway, I'll just put it out there as a possibility. You want to wait at least 4 years before you upgrade anything. And that again is about embodied energy. This gets complicated because say that you want a new program for your podcast or whatever. Well, so then you get the program. It might not be compatible with your older computer, so you might need a new computer. And then once you get the new computer, it might not be compatible with your printer, so you'll need a new printer. And you see how we've stepped into the cascade of embodied energy and buying new things that it just increases our consumption. As we go from 4G to 5G, the televisions that now work at 4G probably won't work at 5G. So everyone will need a new TV. You start to see.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I can also talk about websites.
Okay. What do we need to know?
Okay, so we want to be really selective with video, for example, and flashy slideshows and anything neon. All that takes a lot more data. So using less images, less video, less pictures, that will reduce the consumption of each individual website. I don't know if there's somebody out there who has anything to do with the advertisements that nobody likes, but those are taking up tons of data that we don't need.
So let me ask you,
I don't know what to do about that.
When I think of like images and video, I mean, obviously YouTube and Instagram, I mean, that's what they are, right? I mean,
right.
I mean, what percentage of the data storage do they account for? Like how bad is that on an embodied energy standpoint?
Yeah. Do you know what the most popular category of video is on YouTube?
Is how to an appropriate answer?
No, it's cute cats.
Oh. Okay, I'm not surprised, but yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I once talked to a politician who won't be named, but he said to me, Katie, no politician is going to suggest that we get rid of cute cat videos. And I knew he was right. I knew he was speaking the truth. But basically, we're going to have to start thinking about what's essential, what do we really need to keep, and what can we eliminate. And if we can do this individually and by household, and start asking that question, do we really need this? Well, we might move ourselves into the direction of changing our habits and our expectations and reducing our consumption. When children learn to use electronics before they have speech or before they have mastered reading, writing, or math on paper, then they're expecting an electronic interface for everything, and they've got habits then that will require continued electronic interface for everything. So that's not good to get them acclimated to electronics at such an early age, because then they've got a habit to break that might be really impossible. So delaying children's use of electronics as long as possible that's the ideal, and I know that that's a really hard thing to do, because if you send the child to school, they're going to get a Chromebook, and right now with the virus, schools are passing out Chromebooks for free and hotspots for free so that kids can, quote unquote, go to school online. So all of these things they might be really good ideas, but actually implementing them is not so easy.
Right. My head is spinning, and I'm trying to figure out, what to shelf for a future conversation and what to try to work in here. So one of the things that I've been thinking about since you and I started having these conversations is, with my own usage of a laptop and a phone, I noticed that I plug my phone in periodically throughout the day. Would there be benefit to setting a goal as an individual to try to only charge your phone once a day, for example? That would limit, I think in theory, it would, at least in my head, it would limit how much I stream, how much I use it, how much electricity I have to pull from the grid to, charge it. But then, with what you said at the beginning of this, 81% of its usage happens before I even get it out of the box. So, again, it comes back to just kind of throwing our hands up in the air, what can we do?
So if you limit how much video you watch, say in a week, that would help. And then we're starting to look at infrastructure, because if we decrease our demand for video, well, then we don't need all the broadband that the industry says we need so that it can deploy 5G. And video takes a lot to transmit. There are images. As I understand, there are 60 images per second in a video. There's also sound. That is way more in the file than if you're sending 100 pages of text.
Right.
So, yes, we need to give ourselves media diets. And however you arrange it, if you're saying that if you charged your phone less often, that would be a mechanism for putting you on a diet, where you would say, okay, I'm only going to be able to watch an hour of video on this charge, or whatever it is. That would be great. That would, you're starting to come up with methods. I have this dream that a team of engineers will come together with questions like what you're asking right now, and they'll take your question and study it and tell you the answer. But we need people who are creating questions, and then we need a team of experts that responds to those questions. And we also need lay people who can make sure that the engineers answer our questions in terms we understand. We're
Right.
looking for overall reduction of our consumption of energy and raw materials.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
So I have a few more questions that I want to toss your way while we're talking today. And I just want to stop for a second and remind our listeners or prompt our listeners, like you just said, Katie, we need more questions. So if you guys, as you're listening, if you have questions, send them to me and I will create a document that I can share with Katie that has all of your questions, our questions. Maybe we'll cover some of them on future episodes with Katie, or, if we don't get to them, then, maybe Katie can pass them along to, the appropriate people, or get us answers, whatever. But please send us your questions. Katie, I want to go back to 5G, and there is a lot of fear all over the world around 5G. I mean, we're seeing infrastructure being burned down in Europe. I don't want to advocate destruction of property like that, but when you have something that is being banned in cities, it's being banned in certain countries, and then you have other countries that are throwing the infrastructure up without even holding public hearings, how do we best proceed as an individual and as a community to try to do what is best for our health and the future of our communities?
Ooh, that's the question. That is a really good question. I think, there's so many problems here. Number one, we need to acknowledge that laws and regulations have been in place for nearly a century. I'm talking now about the United States, which has modeled, its legislation has served as a model for other countries. We have excluded biological harm from our telecommunications systems since we established the FCC in 1934. And lots of federal legislation has specifically said that you cannot have health or environmental concerns interfering with the placement of a cellular antenna. So that was the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
You shared that on our previous podcast, and that's the one that shook me to my core. Like I've still not forgotten that one. I think about that a lot.
So if we look at, so that we're now 24 years downwind from that act. We have other acts that repeat that Section 704, prohibiting consideration of health or environmental concerns. We also have federal acts that say that you cannot have a moratorium on small cell sites for any reason. And a lot of states and municipalities have gotten on board with that. They're in agreement with that federal legislation because people here, legislators here, well, we want more broadband for people. So we're in this crazy dynamic where now, for example, with the virus, everyone is meeting online. That's the only place to connect. Right. And so people are saying, well, we need more broadband. Let's go over it again. And the only way for our kids to get to school is to use a computer and to have a hotspot. And so we absolutely need more infrastructure. So we're in a big mess. To go back to your question of how do we reduce our consumption? How do we protect our health? How do we say no to 5G? We will need to change some laws. We'll need to repeal some laws like Section 704 and other laws that take away local authority over telecom infrastructure. It'll be interesting because people aren't going to have money. If people don't have money for food, will they still buy a new smartphone? I have taught in countries where people did not have money for food or shoes, but they had cell phones. And I've heard of people in India that people were traveling just a couple years ago to India and reporting to me that cell phones are passed out like candy, and they're probably older model smartphones that people in Western countries did not purchase. But then people get hooked on them, and the infrastructure is there, and so everybody's got a phone. So, I'm going to go back to saying we need to be aware of the true costs involved. And then if we can repeal some of the laws that prohibit local authority, that is worthwhile as a start. And just reducing our own use and rationing our own use, that again is a really good start. And I'll say again, if we could create a forum where people could ask questions like, hey, will this really matter if I only watch 1 hour of video per week? And if we get engineers to answer that question, I think that would be great.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to, my immediate answer to that would be it would have to, right? I mean, absolutely. If the entire United States limited their streaming to 1 hour a week, I mean, that would be an enormous difference. I think. I mean, that would be my prediction, but I don't know. I want to throw a couple other questions at you. So as you were talking through that last answer, I wrote something down. Like, if we were to recycle old computers, old tablets, old cell phones, I mean, would that have any impact on the embodied energy of new devices? Like, can they reuse some of the silica that goes into transistors or some of the things that go into the screens?
Yes. Okay. So recycling also takes an enormous amount of energy, where you have robots that take computers apart and find, say, the gold. There's gold on circuit boards. Not a lot, but there's a little bit of it. And actually, the gold and silver medals for the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, which are not happening. But those medals, MEDALS, those medals were made out of recycled smartphones. They were.
Well, that's cool.
It was a good commercial. And I'm going to say again, it takes tremendous energy to mine that used metal. So
is the net lower than going for new?
Okay, I think it, yes.
Okay.
So there's, it's called virgin mining or urban mining. And urban mining uses much less energy than virgin mining, but it's still a lot. And what we might do is require manufacturers to make modular electronics. We need right to repair legislation. In some cases, repairing your computer is not allowed. You have to send it back to the manufacturer, even though you own it. So we need right to repair legislation, and if you have a part that's broken, it would be modular, so you could replace that part instead of upgrading to a whole new device. We could also benefit from requiring manufacturers to prove that they have responsible and safe practices for their workers all along the supply chain.
Yeah.
That's another really ambitious goal, but we can have it on the table.
Right. Just a couple more questions on 5G and exposure. and I guess one other thing that I'll throw out too, just with just some ideas for reducing usage and reducing exposure. If you have a Wi-Fi router, use a Christmas light timer so that it automatically shuts off at night. Keep your phone off of your physical person whenever possible. Use airplane mode as much as possible. Some of these I actually got from Katie the first time we talked. And I guess when it comes to 5G, I know that, as we've already talked about, the penetration may not be as strong, the reach may not be as strong, but
it's not, and that's not. That's well. Go ahead and finish your question.
Okay, so a question would be, and I don't know if you've seen some of these things, but there are some clothing items being manufactured now that are supposed to block EMFs and things like that, and they utilize Faraday cages for underwear or undershirts. Are those things effective? Could you do a Faraday cage on your house if you wanted to prevent a 5G cell site that was, right on the corner of your house from getting, yeah.
Yeah. So I am very proud to say I have no gizmo to endorse. I am very skeptical of stuff. And you can buy paint that has flecks of aluminum in it, for example, that will supposedly shield you from certain radio frequencies. The trouble is that I know people who spent $20,000 trying to shield themselves from different antennas. And they built a wall and did some other things. They were unaware of cell sites coming from another direction. And so the frequencies actually bounced off the wall and into their home after they built this $20,000 wall. In order to do this properly, to shield yourself properly, you need to do constant monitoring with really expensive meters, and you need a team of people who really know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I don't know too many people who can afford that. So I vote for unplugging as much as possible, certainly while you sleep. And then in terms of creating a Faraday cage, that is also complicated because a Faraday cage will protect you from radio frequencies. It won't protect you from extremely low frequencies, which are in the, let's say in the 60 hertz cycle or even lower. And if you have electronic equipment like we're using right now, it will have switch mode power supplies embedded in the equipment, and switching mode power supplies typically chop the current, the 60 hertz cycle current, and create dirty power. And the Faraday cage isn't going to block that out.
Right. Okay. So
I'm going to go back to unplugging as much as possible.
All right. I'm going to see if I can get anything more than that out of you. You, for our listeners, you live in New Mexico. Let's just pretend that you lived in New York City or San Francisco. What would you do in an apartment in one of those cities to reduce your exposure?
So I would make sure that my bedroom was the room in the house with the least exposure. I would make sure that everything around my bed was unplugged. So if my head is against a wall and on the other side of the wall I've got the refrigerator or I've got my office with the computer plugged in. I'm going to have to move my furniture so that my head is not up against that equipment. And certainly while I'm sleeping, I want everything in that room unplugged. That's a start. You don't want to charge anything while you're sleeping. You don't want one of those $10 alarm clocks, digital alarm clocks next to your bed, because they emit magnetic fields that are not good. You don't want your phone near you either. So I used to tell people to get a cheap $2 used wind up alarm clock from the thrift shop, but all the thrift shops are closed right now. So yeah, I'm going to say again, you want to unplug, you want to reduce, and then gently you want to develop relationships with neighbors so that they're on the same page and they're also unplugging their stuff while they sleep. But that's really advanced. And yeah, because I mean, I've tried that in my neighborhood, and I mean, people just think I'm nuts often because, if they have teenagers who are up all night playing video games and I'm suggesting that they unplug their Wi-Fi, I might as well, I could suggest other things that would be more constructive. So it's really hard to do.
Right. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think there's really nothing else I want to open up for today's episode. I mean, like we've said, you're going to be back on, and we're going to dive into some of these other topics, a lot deeper. So, is there anything, Katie, that you would want to cover today that we haven't gotten to yet, or anything that you would want to say?
I want to say I'm still really touched by your interest in this and your asking questions and wanting to reduce your consumption for your health, but also for the good of the whole planet, and just recognizing how much goes into a smartphone when you're just touching it and it's pretty simple to stream a video or whatever. And I'm really touched by that, and that you have listeners who are already sending in questions. All that it really moves me. And this is such a personal thing to learn about. And yet we have to come together in order to make an impact that matters, beyond one person doing anything. So I just want to say I appreciate that for you, from you, Ryan, and from everyone who's in it with us.
Well, I appreciate the work that you're doing and the approach that you have to sharing your knowledge. This is, as you were talking through that, one of the things that I was going to highlight, and that's, like you said, this is a very personal, very individual thing. And I think so many of these conversations tend to be polarizing or, extremist. You have to be all the way over here, or if you're not, you're over there and you're wrong. And that doesn't move the conversation forward. It doesn't move communities or, nations or the world closer to positive outcomes. And, I appreciate your approach because I think it helps facilitate the desired outcomes. And, when I get to do leadership talks and when I work with companies and teams, that's one of the things that I'm trying to help them focus on. And I guess that would be a final question for you is, as our listeners finish this episode and, may want to share some of the things that they learn with people in their lives, how do we have these conversations in a way that encourages other people to have an interest, or maybe not even have an interest, but have the desire to audit their own behaviors and their own usage. How do we continue to be inclusive in this conversation and not polarizing or extremist?
What comes to me here, there's a quote that I learned from Bill Torbert, who is a retired management professor at Boston College. And he says, if you're not aware that you are part of the problem, then you can't be part of the solution. So I come from this place of recognizing that I am absolutely part of the problem. And that's my focus, is my contribution to the problem. It's not for me to tell other people what to do, including when I'm in front of a microphone here.
Right.
I can just tell you things that I've learned, but I can't tell you. I can tell you things I haven't figured out yet, and things that I'm struggling with, but I really wouldn't know. Yeah, it's not for me to say what everyone else should be doing.
Right. That's a really good point, and I think that is one of the things that makes your work so approachable, is that when, at least for me, when I look at you, I have to assume that your consumption, your usage, your role as a part of the problem is significantly less than mine or the average person. And for you to still be saying like, hey, I'm in this with you guys, and we're all doing this. Like, I think that's part of the reason that, you're pulling people into the conversation, as opposed to maybe some other either people or pieces of media that are kind of like pointing the finger.
Can I read something? And it'll take another couple of minutes. I know
Sure. Go ahead.
we've gone a long time, but 2 years ago I spoke at the United Nations, a great privilege. But I met this man who co-founded India Climate Justice, Soumya Dutta, and I'd just like to read this piece that he and I worked on. It's really his statement. Let me just read it.
Yeah.
In the 20th century, the human population increased fourfold, from 1.6 to 6.1 billion people. During the same time, global energy consumption increased between 12-fold and 16-fold. Whenever 1 unit of energy is produced and consumed, water, land, and other bioresources are also consumed, and hazardous waste is generated. In other words, because of cars, electricity, air conditioning, and smartphones, the average person now uses over 4 times the amount of natural resources that our grandparents consumed. Meanwhile, 2 decades into the 21st century, there are now 6 billion more of us alive. Actually, referring here to average people is not correct. According to the World Bank, the average Indian consumes about 630 kilograms of oil equivalent, KGOE, per year. The average Bangladeshi consumes less than 300 KGOE. The average U.S. American annually consumes over 6,000 KGOE. That would be you and me. To provide every global citizen with a decent opportunity for a healthy life, starting with vitally needed basic infrastructure such as clean water and toilets, some of the poorest countries with the lowest emissions might actually need to increase their per capita energy consumption. To reduce sufficiently the burden that humans impose on natural ecosystems, wealthier nations that consume excessive amounts will need to reduce their consumption of energy and water by at least 70% and completely eliminate their greenhouse gas emissions. So even if I'm on the lower end of the scale for the average US American, and I'm probably smack average. I am using, 20 times the amount of energy of a Bangladeshi and 10 times the amount of energy that the average person in India uses. So for me to, that's why I came up with that 3% figure, because reducing my consumption by 70% seems so intimidating. So I'm not, compared to another American, we're talking fine points if we compare me to the majority of people in the world, in India and Bangladesh.
Well, it's a lot to think about. I think this is a good place to wrap it up. So again, Katie, thank you so much for being a part of Better Human Project and for the work that you do. Thank you for sharing all of this information with us. And I really hope that our listeners send in some questions, that we can, pose to you when we have you back on. And I'm really excited to see your paper come out and talk to you, about electric cars and, solar power and some of that stuff that, may need to have the other side of those conversations be explored.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to those questions.
All right. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.